Have you ever wondered what happens to your soul in the last seconds before you die? Do you imagine your guardian angel simply vanishes? That death is quiet? That nothing is fighting for you as your breath slows? What if the room you die in is not empty at all? What if it's the most crowded room you'll ever be in? Padre Pio saw it. He spent 50 years watching what happens at the edge of life, and what he saw will change how you think about your own last breath tonight. If your heart is already listening, stay with me and subscribe so you don't miss where this leads. You've probably never thought about your own death as a battle. Most people don't. You think of dying as something that just happens to you, the way weather happens, the way a light switches off. One moment you're here, the next you're not. And whatever comes after, comes after. That's the assumption almost everyone carries, quietly, without ever examining it. It feels safe to think that way. It feels like nothing is required of you. But that's not what the Church has ever taught, and it's certainly not what Padre Pio saw with his own eyes, over and over, for half a century. There is a world laid directly over this one. You walk through it every day without seeing it. It's there when you pray in your car, there when you kneel in a pew, there when you whisper a name in the dark, because you're scared and don't know who else to ask. Most of the time you never notice it. But at the moment of death, the veil between that world and this one gets thin. And what waits on the other side of that veil is not passive. It's not neutral. It's not just light and silence. It's a fight. Padre Pio knew that fight personally, before he ever stood at another person's deathbed. He lived it in his own body, night after night, for years. To understand what he saw happen to others when they died, you first have to understand who he was and why his eyes could be trusted at all. He was a man who lived with one foot in this world and the other in the next. He carried the wounds of Christ's crucifixion in his own hands and feet and side, and he bled from them, quietly, for 50 years. He didn't parade it. He covered his hands with fingerless gloves and kept saying, Mass, kept hearing confessions, kept living an ordinary daily life while carrying something no doctor could explain, and no wound would ever close. He suffered in his body every day for half a century, and he never once used it to draw attention to himself. He spent up to 10 hours a day in a small wooden confessional, listening to the worst things people had ever done, and he never once turned a person away for being too far gone. People came from across Italy, then across the world, and they waited days, just for a few minutes with him. He was not a gentle old man who told people what they wanted to hear. He was a man who did not use soft words when he could use true ones. If you were lying to yourself, he would tell you. If you were carrying something you thought was unforgivable, he would tell you that too, and he would tell you it was already forgiven, the moment you were sorry. And he was attacked. Not spiritually attacked in some vague, poetic sense. Actually, attacked. He wrote letters describing nights when he was struck, thrown from his own bed, his shirt torn from his body by something he could not see, but could absolutely feel. In one letter he wrote, "These devils don't stop striking me, even making me fall down from the bed. They even tear off my shirt to beat me." His brothers in the monastery heard the noise. They found him in the morning, bruised, his face swollen, his body marked by a fight no one else had witnessed. That's the man who later sat beside the dying. Not a theologian describing death in the abstract. A man who had already spent decades trading blows with the thing that shows up at the very end. So when Padre Pio talked about death, he wasn't guessing. He wasn't offering comfort, because comfort was expected of him. He was telling you what he had already seen, up close, more times than anyone could count. Here is the first thing you need to understand, and it is not opinion. It is not folklore passed down through devout grandmothers. It's the actual teaching of the Church, written plainly, for anyone who wants to read it. The moment you die, you are judged. Not later. Not after some waiting room. The instant your soul leaves your body, you stand before Christ, and your whole life is laid open in front of Him, and a judgment is made. The Church calls this the particular judgment, and it is not a maybe. It's doctrine. Hebrews puts it plainly. It is appointed for you to die once, and after that, judgment. Not eventually. After that. Sit with that for a second. Every argument you've ever had, every private kindness no one saw, every prayer you thought went nowhere, every sin you thought you got away with, all of it, present, immediate, the second you take your last breath. There's no delay built in. There's no grace period to get your story straight. You stand there exactly as you are. That should terrify you a little. It terrified people who came to Padre Pio too. But here's what he also knew, what he'd seen with total certainty, and what most people never stop to consider. You don't walk into that moment alone. Do you know who's been with you since before you could speak? Since before you could even understand what a prayer was? From the moment your life began, an angel has been assigned to you, not a metaphor, not a comforting bedtime image for children, a real, personal being, given to you specifically, whose whole purpose is your protection and your path back to God. The Church teaches this plainly. From infancy to death, human life is surrounded by that angel's watchful care. Beside you, right now, whether you feel it or not, stands a protector. Padre Pio didn't just believe this the way you might believe something you were taught as a child and never questioned again. He lived an active, daily relationship with his own guardian angel. He talked about sending his angel as a messenger to people who needed help. He described consolation that came directly through that angel during his worst nights of demonic attack. In a letter to a woman named Anita, he wrote something that should stop you cold. How consoling it is to know that we have a Spirit who, from the womb to the tomb, never leaves us even for an instant. From the womb to the tomb, not almost the whole way, not most of your life, every single second of it, including the very last one. He saw that presence as real as the chair you're sitting in right now. And if it's real for him, it's real for you too, whether you've ever spoken to your angel or not. This is not a comforting story you tell yourself to feel better about dying. This is not poetry. Padre Pio saw it, lived it, and staked his own suffering on its truth. But here's where it gets harder. Because if there is a guardian standing beside you, your whole life, protecting you toward Christ, there is also something working against that. And nowhere is that opposition more concentrated than in your final moments. The Church has a specific sacrament for the dying. You may have heard it called last rites, or anointing of the sick. Most people think of it as a kind of spiritual paperwork, a formality, something a priest does so the family feels better. That is not what it is. Listen to how the Church itself describes what this sacrament does. It says the sacrament prepares the dying person for, in its own words, the final struggle before entering the Father's house. Final struggle. Not final rest. Not final peace. Struggle. The Catechism itself, the Church's own official teaching, uses the language of combat to describe what happens as you die. That word wasn't chosen by accident. The Church is telling you, plainly, that your death is not the quiet closing of a door. It is one last fight, and the sacraments exist to arm you for it. This is not fantasy. This is not superstition dressed up in old language. This is the reality that surrounds the last moments of every human life, according to the Church's own teaching, whether you ever think about it or not. So what does that struggle actually look like? What was Padre Pio actually seeing, night after night, standing at bedsides across decades? He saw it happen the same way, over and over. He saw the enemy make one last attempt right at the very end, not through fire or spectacle, but through something quieter and far more effective: despair. The temptation, at the very last moment of a life, is almost never commit one more sin. It's, you're already too far gone. It's too late for you. Don't even bother asking. That is the final weapon, not violence, doubt. Padre Pio understood that better than almost anyone alive in his century, because he'd felt that exact temptation aimed at himself, over and over, in his own dark nights. Let me tell you about a man who came to him once. He hadn't set foot inside a church in 40 years, not since he was a boy. He'd lived a hard life, done things he wasn't proud of, and somewhere along the way he'd simply decided the door was closed to him, that too much time had passed, that men like him didn't get forgiven. He only came to Padre Pio because his daughter begged him to, thinking it might be his last chance, and honestly, not expecting anything to change. He knelt in that confessional expecting judgment, expecting to be told what he already believed about himself. Instead, Padre Pio grabbed his arm and said, "Do you know what you just did?" The man didn't understand the question. Padre Pio told him plainly, "You just let God back into a room he's been standing outside of for 40 years, and he never once stopped waiting for that door to open. This is not a story about a man getting lucky with a kind priest. This is about a weapon you've been carrying without realizing its power, the truth that no sin is greater than God's mercy. Only despair is." Padre Pio said some version of that line to dozens of people over the years. Despair was the only door he ever described as truly closed, not because God closed it, because the person, convinced they weren't worth saving, closed it themselves. That's what he saw waiting at so many deathbeds. Not fire, not monsters in the traditional sense. A whisper aimed at exhausted, frightened people. "It's too late. Don't bother. You're not worth the fight." And he saw, again and again, that the whisper was a lie, and that the moment someone refused to believe it, something shifted in the room. He saw it happen. Not once, 1,000 times, across 50 years of sitting with the dying and the frightened and the ashamed. Here's a second story, because you need to hear how this looked in someone who wasn't hardened at all, someone who'd done nothing wrong, and still felt the same fear. A woman who had prayed the Hail Mary every single night for 30 years came to him once, not because she'd sinned greatly, but because she was terrified of dying anyway. She loved God. She went to Mass. She raised her children in the faith. And still, when she thought about her own death, all she felt was dread, a certainty that when the moment came, she wouldn't be good enough, that somewhere a scale would tip against her. Padre Pio didn't correct her theology with a long lecture. He gave her 4 words, words that are now some of the most repeated words he ever said, words carved into plaques and stitched into embroidery in homes all over the world, though most people who own them have no idea what battlefield they came from. He told her, "Pray, hope, and don't worry." Say that slowly. Pray, hope, and don't worry. Not, don't worry because everything will be fine, no matter what you do. Not empty comfort. He was telling her precisely what he'd watched happen in that final struggle, over and over. The people who spent their dying moments gripped by anxious worry gave the enemy exactly the opening he was looking for. Worry is doubt wearing a respectable mask, and the antidote isn't certainty about your own worthiness. It's trust in someone else's mercy. This is not immediately obvious, not casually understood, not mechanically repeated the way a slogan gets repeated. He meant something specific and hard-won by those 4 words, forged out of what he'd personally watched happen at bedside after bedside. Prayer keeps you facing the right direction. Hope keeps the door open. And worry is the crack the whisper crawls through. You should know, too, that not everyone gets a warning. Not everyone gets time to prepare, to call a priest, to say the things they meant to say. Some of you reading this, some of the people you love, will die suddenly. A heart that simply stops. a car that doesn't stop in time, no last rites, no final words, no chance to set anything right. Do you imagine that person is somehow at a disadvantage in front of God? That the ones who die unprepared face a harder judgment because there was no time for a priest, no candle, no incense? Padre Pio never taught that, and neither has the Church, not for one single day of its existence. The Church says plainly that God is not bound by his own sacraments, even while he binds himself to work through them for us. That means the sacraments are real, are powerful, are worth receiving. And also that God's mercy was never a formality that only reaches people who had time to schedule an appointment with it. This is why the Church has always encouraged something most people have never heard of: praying for a happy death, not just once, at the very end, but as a habit, starting now, tonight, decades before you'll need it. Not because prayer is a magic password you have to say at the right moment, because a life spent turning toward God builds a habit your soul falls back into instinctively, even in a moment too fast for thought. The soldier who trains for years doesn't need to consciously remember his training in the half-second before impact. His body already knows. Padre Pio believed your soul works the same way. There's a third person you should know about, one who shows you what the other side of this same fight looks like when it goes exactly as it should. A devout man, surrounded by his family, given the anointing of the sick in his final days, spent his last hours not gripped in fear, but strangely at peace, praying quietly with his wife and children around the bed. Nothing dramatic happened in that room. No visions, no miracles, nothing you could put in a headline. And that quiet, unremarkable peace is exactly the point. That is what it looks like when the final struggle is met with everything the Church actually gives you to fight it: the sacrament, the family praying nearby, a life already turned toward God, a soul that had practiced trust long before it needed it. The battle Padre Pio described doesn't always look like a battle from the outside. Sometimes winning it looks like silence, not weakened, not merely calm by accident, genuinely at peace, because the fight had already been fought, day after day, for years before that final hour ever arrived. Now think about the hardest version of this. Think about a mother sitting beside the bed of a dying child. If you are a parent, or you love a child, this is the moment you may not want to hear, and also the one you most need to, because you might wonder, does that same struggle happen there too? Does a small child, barely old enough to understand sin, face the same fight Padre Pio described in grown men carrying 40 years of guilt? He never taught that, and the Church has never taught that. Christ himself said, "Let the little children come to me, and do not stop them, for the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these." Children are held in a particular tenderness in the Church's teaching, a mercy that doesn't require the same battle-tested trust an adult has to build over a lifetime. If you have ever sat beside a child's bed and wondered whether that room held the same darkness Padre Pio described elsewhere, let this be clear: it does not. That room holds urgency, and grief, and a mother's unbearable love, and a mercy that reaches for the smallest and weakest first, not last. You needed to hear that plainly, without hedging. So step back for a moment and look at the whole shape of what you've just been shown. Two worlds laid one over the other every single day of your life. A guardian who has never once left your side since before you could speak. A judgment that comes the instant you take your last breath, not delayed, not negotiable. And a final struggle in those last moments, real enough that the Church built an entire sacrament to arm you for it. He saw it. He saw the man who thought the door was closed find out it never was. He saw the woman who prayed every night finally let go of her worry instead of her faith. He saw the sudden deaths that were not disadvantaged, and the quiet, peaceful deaths that were the fruit of years of practiced trust, and the small, sacred exception carved out for children. He saw the whisper of despair try, again and again, to close a door that God had never actually shut. So what does this mean for you tonight, specifically, not someday, not in the abstract? It means the moment for preparing is not your last hour. It's this one. Padre Pio never told the people who came to him to wait until their deathbed to start trusting God. He told them to build the habit now, while there's time to build it slowly, one prayer at a time, so that when the final struggle comes, your soul already knows which way to lean. It means the rosary in your drawer, the one you maybe haven't touched in months, is not decoration. It's not a keepsake from a grandmother's funeral. When friars once searched Padre Pio's own cell near the end of his life for what they jokingly called his weapon, unable to find anything, he simply pointed to his rosary and asked them, "And is this not a weapon? The true weapon?" He wasn't speaking in metaphor for effect. He meant it as plainly as he meant everything else he said. Pick it up. Use it. Don't wait for the hour you'll need it most to remember it exists. It means that if you are carrying something you think is too old, too shameful, too far gone to bring back to God, you are believing the exact whisper Padre Pio spent his whole life warning people against. No sin is greater than God's mercy. Only despair is. Say that to yourself again, slowly, until it replaces whatever quieter, crueler sentence you've been repeating instead. It means that if you love someone who is dying, or who has already died suddenly, with no time to prepare, you do not need to fear for them the way you might have an hour ago. God was not waiting for a scheduled appointment. He was already there, the way He is already with you, right now, in this ordinary moment, reading these words. And it means your own guardian angel, the one who has been with you from the womb, is not a story for children. He is standing nearer to you at this exact second than you have ever let yourself believe. Padre Pio spoke to his, sent him on errands of mercy for other people, leaned on him in the middle of nights so violent that his own brothers found him bruised the next morning. If a man who bore the wounds of Christ in his own hands needed that companionship to survive his fight, you are allowed to need it too. Do you imagine your guardian angel leaves you when you die? Padre Pio saw the truth, lived it, suffered for it, and gave the rest of his life to telling anyone who would listen. From the womb to the tomb, he never leaves you, not even for an instant, not at your first breath, not at your last. Pray now, trust now, reach for the one already reaching for you.